Today's lecture is on food and culture. So we're going to start by talking separately about what food itself and what culture actually is. Then we'll put it all together. Food may sound like a pretty simple thing. It's something that we eat on a daily basis, and it provides nutrients and vitamins and minerals and all the things that we need to grow and maintain ourselves. But if you think about food a little bit more deeply and on a more complex level than that, food represents a lot of different things. And as we find out, as we go on through this class, that food is a major way that people express themselves in terms of their culture. So, on a deeper level, if we're looking at food, we can see that it offers a means of emotional comfort. We've all heard the term comfort food. It's a way that people can nurture each other. One of the most basic things that parents do for their children is provide them food and provide them nourishment. And so there's a very nurturing aspect to it. And that comes into play in the process by which a small child, begins to learn about the culture that it's in. A big part of that is the food that the child is eating. In the next part of this slide here, you see a quote from a book called Edible Memory. The author, Jennifer Jordan, says, and I paraphrase this a bit here, smell is the sense that is actually responsible for much of what we experience as flavor. It's connected to the part of our brains responsible for memory. A particular smell or flavor can instantly trigger a very vivid memory. And I put that in there because I think it's an important part, or can be an important part, of the process of learning one's culture. You may have had the experience where you encounter a smell, a food smell, or some smell associated with food that maybe triggers a very, very old memory, maybe from when you're a child. Those memories are very powerful. Smell is a very, very powerful way that we remember things, and food is chief among them. And many times that smell experience can come from the process of learning your culture. So maybe that smell is roasting chilies, or a particular spice or herb, or a particular food. Those memories go in large part to help make us who we are, and our culture is a very big part of who we are for many of us. Sometimes food can be a symbol of ethnic pride, ethnic or racial pride, and we're going to talk about the difference between race and ethnicity in a couple of slides. But many people are very proud of the background that they have, and so particular foods can help them celebrate that. Sometimes, for some folks, there can be a little bit of shame attached to that, and that may be because of, that's a very complex topic, but if there is some reason that somebody wants to downplay where they came from going into a new country, for example, that can be sort of a reminder of who and what they are. And if they don't have good feelings about it, that can bring up some shameful feelings with those memories. Finally, what we're going to spend a lot of this course talking about is that food is a substance that lends itself to great planning. What I mean by that is, if you think of all the steps that go together to put together a meal, everything from procurement, which is actually going and getting the food, whether that be going into the wild and hunting down an animal, or looking for berries and herbs and things like that, or simply going to the grocery store, there's a lot of planning that goes into getting that meal started. So you've got to get all of your ingredients, and then you need to process the ingredients, whether it's slicing or cooking or whatever it is that you're going to do with that particular food. A lot of food culture surrounds the procurement and preparation of foods. And we're going to get way more into that as we go through this course. But for many national dishes or ethnic dishes, there's a reason that the materials that are in those foods are used, and there's a reason that many times they're processed the way that they are. And in a lot of cases, it has to do with the preservation of the food, because of course we didn't always have access to refrigeration or as good food preservation as we have now. So a lot of dishes can be traced to the preparation, certain reasons they had to be prepared certain ways. The last thing I have in here is rules of use. So the rules of use, of course, with food, we're just talking about eating the food. But if you think a little deeper about that, what this entails is manners. And so we have, even here in our majority American culture, we have certain things that we consider very rude at the table and other things that are considered very acceptable. And again, we'll get into that as we go throughout the remainder of the lecture. And the little cartoon I have on here is happiness is when your grandma cooks you a favorite dish. And that is just kind of some of the warm and fuzzy feelings that can come out of food. And again, for somebody who's very prideful of their ethnic or racial background, those foods, those particular foods that are associated with that particular background, can give you sort of the warm fuzzies, give you that feeling of pride and happiness. This is a quote from the First Lady. I put it on here just because it sort of backs up the points that I made in the last slide. Food can be a symbol of cultural identity. It knits families together. What I've come to appreciate is whether you're African American, Puerto Rican, Dominican, or Cuban, food is love. And that again is that pride in background and that nurturing capacity of food. As we're going to talk about, that process of beginning to learn culture starts very young, starts as children, and food is such a basic way of showing not only nourishment but love. That it's really a nice way to introduce that culture to a young person. So let's talk for a moment about what we mean when we say culture. And you can see the definition here on the slide: a set of values and beliefs considered important to a given set of people, frequently exhibited as outward behaviors or attitudes. So essentially what it is a set of rules that everybody in a given society has agreed upon and decided that this is the way they're going to live. These are the things that they value, and they're going to position themselves and their activities in a way that honor those beliefs. And that becomes culture over time. Culture is learned. You know, a child who is born in China doesn't know how to be Chinese. Rather, that child learns how to be Chinese over a period of time. As it gets older, it sees what the child sees what its family is eating, what they're wearing, how they're speaking, what kind of manners they're showing at the table, how they interact with each other. They're learning what is normal, and that process is called enculturation. They have to learn how to be part of that culture. Culture can change over time, and we'll talk about that as we go through the class. A lot of that has to do with migration and the effects that migration has on a particular culture or on the group that a particular culture is moving into. Technology, I think, has a lot to do with it because things change over time, and we're seeing that happen all over the world right now. So culture tends to not be static over
long periods of time, but it may be, different than it was traditionally, just because of these outside influences, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the class. Let's talk about ethnicity. Ethnicity is merely the term that is used for somebody who belongs to a particular culture. So it's important to make sure not to confuse ethnicity with country of origin. And you look at any country around the world, and in many cases there are different ethnic groups, many different ethnic groups represented within that country. You can go to China, for example, and find groups of people that can't understand each other, even though they speak different dialects. They may all be Asian and they may all be Chinese, but different parts, especially in a country like China that's so big, different parts value different things. They speak different languages. They eat different foods because of what grows where they are. And we can look at the United States as well. The United States is a great melting pot of all sorts of cultures, and people that identify as American, they are American, born and raised here, but they may be of a different ethnicity. So we have people who have come from Latin America and people who've come from Asia and different parts of the world still have their cultural beliefs, although they're still considered American. The other thing to remember is that there are other groups that are kind of scattered all over the world and have a common ancestry in terms of a cultural ancestry. And one of the groups I think stands out there is when we talk about Jews. Judaism is a religion, and we're going to talk about that in the next couple lectures. But Jews are scattered throughout the world, and we know that in terms of cultural development, that started in the Middle East. And over time, there was the diaspora, which was basically the event where Jews left their homeland and really kind of scattered all over the world. And so Jews don't have a central, they didn't really have a central homeland until the 1940s when Israel was designated. But, for a really long time, they were scattered all over the place, but they still practiced their culture through what they ate, through what they wore, through their language, and so on and so forth.
So let's talk a little bit about the difference between ethnicity and race. As I said, these are easily confused sometimes, and they're very different things. What I want you to understand for the purposes of this class is that race is associated with your biology, with your genetic makeup, and ethnicity is purely associated with culture. So when we talk about race, we're talking about whether somebody is Asian or Caucasian or black. That is all genetically determined. But you can have two people from the same race that live in different areas, and culturally they might be really different. So if we look at Asia, for example, Asia is a huge landmass, and you can have somebody who is Korean and somebody who's Vietnamese. They're both Asian, but in terms of their culture, what they eat, what they wear, their language, what they value, can actually be very different. So for the purposes of this class, that's what I want you to understand. Let's talk a little bit about the United States. The United States is a country made of immigrants. We had a native population here, the American Indians. We're going to talk about them as our first cultural group in a few weeks. But the thing about the United States is, as I said, we are a country of immigrants. Most of us came from somewhere else. Most of us our ancestors came from other parts of the world to the United States for the opportunities that are offered here. So that hasn't stopped. People are still very much immigrating here from other countries. And if we take a look at the most recent census data in the United States, what we find is that all 50 states have higher proportions of foreign-born young adults than 30 years ago. And as we'll see in a little bit later in this slide here, that these folks are coming from different places now than they did even 50 years ago. It's very different. Right now, 1 in 4 young adults, or 17.9 million people, speak a language other than English at home. And that's the whole country. If we look at certain states, and you can see here on the slide, if we take a look here in California, it's about 1 in 2. So 1 in 2 young adults in California speaks a different language other than English at home. In 1960, this is what I was talking about, in 1960, 75% of the foreign-born U.S. population came from Europe. So that is quite some time ago, more than 50 years ago. If we fast forward to 2010, 53%, the majority came from Latin America, Latin American countries, and 28% from Asia, whereas only 12% came from Europe. So there's a big shift in who is coming to the United States, and that is having an effect on majority American culture. It's changing. As I said, culture is changing, and it's not a static thing. It changes. The dynamics of culture change in response to the environment. So where we have more people coming from Asian countries and Latin American countries, that's going to change sort of the flavor of what the United States looks like in time. So it's very interesting. It's just sort of an ongoing process, and something that we see pronounced more in time as these folks come from other countries and have children here, and their children grow into to absorb majority American culture, but also retaining some of the flavor of the cultures where their families come from. And over time, it can make some really interesting changes. The African-born population in the United States has roughly doubled every decade since 1970. So in 1970, we had about 80,000 people who came directly from Africa, immigrated from one of the African countries. And between 2008 and 2012, that number increased to 1.6 million. So we have a lot more African immigrants coming into the country as well. In this slide, we're going to talk about some key terms that I want you to be aware of. The first one that you see there is acculturation, which, as you see in the definition, it's the process by which an ethnic group moves into another new majority society and begins to adopt the new society's cultural values and habits. So, an example of this might be a family moving from Mexico into the United States and beginning to adopt some of the cultural values that may be different from where they came from. The important thing to recognize about the acculturation process, and actually many of these terms that we're talking about, is that they generally occur more progressively with each succeeding generation. So if you have a family that moves from Mexico to the United States, once that family produces children and then those children produce children, they tend to become more and more Americanized because they were born here, and the many times the links to the old country are not as strong as they were for the generation that initially came over. Biculturation is where the new culture is seen as a complement to the original culture of origin. So people who adopt biculturation look at the favorable aspects of their native culture with the most positive aspects of the majority culture that they've moved into, and they adopt both of those as habit and as their own personal culture. Assimilation is where people from one cultural group begin to shed their ethnic identity and fully merge into the majority culture. And again, this is something that is seen much more commonly with succeeding generations. You see children of immigrants, first generation immigrants, their children and their children's children becoming more and more Americanized the longer they've been here. Ethnocentrism is a behavior where a person uses his or her own values to evaluate the behavior of others while regarding their own culture as superior to others. So these are folks that may immigrate from one place to another, and they're very critical of the culture that they find in the new place, just really not finding it measuring up to their native culture. Let's talk about how food, how and why really food is such an important part of culture. And one of the most basic differences between us as humans and as animals is that we don't merely feed. Feeding, which is what an animal would do, is merely a process of just getting food into the body, and there's not really much more complexity to it than that. So of course that's what we see with animals. They're just feeding because they need to do that. And of course we as humans need to do that as well. However, we eat rather than feed. So the difference between feeding and eating is that eating requires more process with the food. It requires manners. It requires procedures. It requires rituals. And there's a lot of things that we do as humans, we do with food that, animals just don't do and they're not interested in doing. Humans, from the beginning of time, have either grown food or from the very earliest reaches of time, they've hunted for food and foraged for food. And then later on, of course, food was grown and harvested and cooked and prepared and processed in various ways. We really went from an eat to live model where it was really all people were nomadic, everybody was moving around, there weren't any settlements, people went to where the food was because the important thing at that time was to have enough food to remain alive. So in very, very ancient prehistory, we weren't much different than the animals in that aspect. We were just really trying to eat to live. Living to eat came along a little bit later when people began to settle in different areas and form settlements and form cities. We were a little more able to, settling down allows people to begin to plan out what they want to eat and where they want to eat it. Many times settlements were near water, so there might have been very plentiful fish or seafood or other plants that grew around the water that were reliable sources of nutrients. And so, as we see with a lot of the cultures, and we will see with many of the cultures that we're going to talk about, much of the way they treat food has to do with the environment they live in. If they live along the ocean, then we're going to see seafood being a very important part of the diet and how it's processed and treated. So gradually we became live to eat because we had the luxury of knowing where the food was coming from, and we weren't really having to spend all of our time hunting for food. We were able to plan what we were going to do with that food that we already had. So complex rules about how food is procured and prepared sometimes developed. And for many cultures, the preservation of foods really had a lot to do with how foods are handled. And in early history, of course, as I was talking about a few slides ago, they didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have reliable means of preserving perishable foods like meats and dairy products. And so different things, different procedures, and processing had to be completed with these foods that became ingrained as part of the culture. And as an example for this, we'll talk about some of the Scandinavian countries. Of course, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, they're surrounded by water. And so for much of the population, fish is really important food source. Well, as I was saying, in uh, you know much earlier history, there weren't refrigerators for preservation of fish, and we know what happens when fish goes bad. It smells, really awful, and people, it can be a dangerous food to eat. So, what the Scandinavians did is they developed ways of processing their fish to prevent it from going rotten. Or they actually let the fish go rotten and developed a taste for it. So we'll see that a little bit more when we talk about Scandinavia. But when you have salted cod, dried fish, dried reconstituted fish, those are national dishes and very indicative of the of Scandinavian cultures. The reason that those are the way that they are is because of where the Scandinavian people were, what they ate, and their need to preserve the food. So we'll talk about that more when we get to it, but I just want you to understand that sometimes these complex rules about how food is procured and prepared has everything to do with the atmosphere and the environment that these people lived in. So the next couple of slides are from a website called oldways.org, and it's actually oldwayspt.org. These are what are called heritage pyramids. And what this is it's a series of food pyramids. If you've ever heard of the food pyramid, it just has all the different food groups in it. It's not a model that we use in the United States anymore, but Old Ways still uses this to look at different cultural diets. And so they have the Mediterranean, Asian, African, Latin American, and those are on the next few slides. I want you to take a look at them, and what you'll see is differences in the foods that these different cultures have in their regular diets. And again, the foods that you're going to see are because the folks that are part of these ethnic and racial groups, they live where the foods that are in their pyramid grow. So they're part of the native diet. Foodstuffs are really varied depending on the area of origin, climate, and growing conditions. So a lot of determining what foods were going to be important to a culture depended on whether it was edible and you were able to use it as a reliable food source. So if you had lots of particular type of berry growing in your area, at some point in history, somebody was going to have to try it. And what happens then is that if somebody tries that food and they still stay alive and it tastes pretty good, well, then that can become a native food source. Whereas you eat these special berries and, the guy who was unlucky enough to try it got poisoned and died, everybody knows, okay, don't eat the berry on that bush because it'll kill you. So, it sounds awful, but humans have been trying to figure out what we can and can't eat for, since the beginning of human history. So, you know that there are people that died in that process because they drew the unlucky straw. Let's see, cultural foodways is another way to talk about the different foods that you're going to see in the pyramids in the next couple of slides as well. So dining itself is a part of eating, not feeding. Your dog doesn't stop to have manners and wipe his mouth after he's finished eating. Humans do. Humans generally have sets of rituals that are surrounding the eating process. And it's different depending on where you are. So dining is a set of customs that surrounds the eating process. So what we generally call those customs are manners or etiquette. So in the majority American culture, things like burping at the table or putting your elbows on the table while you're eating are considered rude. And that's a value that is shared by folks in majority American culture, and everybody knows that. And it's something that, as children we're all taught, so as part of that enculturation process. Religious rules, we'll talk a lot about that in the next couple of lectures. And self-identity and expression. Part of culture is displaying self-identity and expression. So we tend to develop our food habits by looking to those in our lives who we admire and who we want to emulate. So food preferences many times are learned from trusted or valued others, elders, social groups, peers. It's interesting that children tend to not be as influenced by their parents as far as food is concerned as they are peers. So many times, when they're looking at peers or other people that they admire, that's much more likely to influence their food decisions than their own parents, which is really sort of interesting. This slide is the Latin American diet pyramid, and I'd like you to just kind of take a look at it. You can see all the different food groups there, fruits, vegetables, grains, and it'll just kind of give you a rough idea of foods that are important in each culture. They're not super detailed because if they were, the pyramid would be so crowded that it would be really hard to kind of see what's going on. But anyway, it'll give you a rough idea of what the different cultural food pyramids look like. So this is the Latin American one. This is the African one. And you certainly can go back to any of these and pause and take a closer look at them. But you'll notice that there are some differences in what people eat and the different foods that you'll see on there. This is the Asian pyramid. Again, looks a little bit different. So we see different forms of food, rice, noodles, those sorts of things. And again, you can take a look at this and get a rough idea of what's important and the differences between the different pyramids. We were just talking about manners and dining etiquette, and one of the things that probably doesn't come to much surprise to any of you is that manners and dining etiquette vary in different parts of the world. So things that would be considered very rude here in the United States could be perfectly acceptable in another culture. So I have a few examples here. What the picture that you see on this slide is a typical Ethiopian meal. And it features something called injera, which is a type of flatbread. It's almost like a pancake more than anything else. And injera is eaten at practically every meal. What you see on this plate may look sort of messy to an average American, but this is a very typical dining style where you take pieces of the injera, these large pancakes, and you just rip it off, and you really use that as sort of your utensil, and you dip it in whatever you want on that plate. So there are sauces and meats and herbs and all kinds of different items on there, and you can dip your injera in whatever you want, and then eat it. And it's very it's communal, so you might have multiple people eating out of the same dish. That's not something that is terribly common here in the United States, but very, very common in Ethiopia. In many Middle Eastern, Indian, and some African countries and cultures, consider it very unclean and very rude to eat using your left hand. The reason for that is because in those countries the left hand is considered to be the hand that is used for personal cleanliness. And so if you're using the restroom and you need to tend to yourself, it is the left hand that you use. So if you were to use your left hand to eat, that would be very, very rude, very inappropriate, and really sort of disgusting in many cultures. So, you know, if you have people that are coming here from those countries and they see, you know, Americans using both hands to eat, they may well be very offended by that and just really think that's rather disgusting. In most of Europe, the US, and Canada, no elbows on the table. You may have, if you are from the United States and your family's been here for generations, you may have heard that direction. Don't put your elbows on the table. That's just considered rude. In France, bread is considered part of the meal, not an appetizer. So you're not going to go to a French restaurant and get the big basket of bread and butter before your meal comes out. That would be considered inappropriate and wrong, the wrong way to dine. People wouldn't understand what you were doing. So those are a few examples, but depending on which part of the world you're in or what we're talking about, the customs are different. And if you're traveling to other countries, it's always a good idea to familiarize yourself with those basic societal and dining rules before you go and embarrass yourself. So just something to think about. All right, let's talk about acculturation of food habits. Food habits are one of the last traditions to change during the process of acculturation. People come to the country, come to another country, let's just say they're coming to the United States, and they will cling to their native ways of eating as much as possible. And sometimes this is easier done depending on what the food is and where people are coming from. I think that nowadays it's much easier for somebody coming from another country to find native ingredients here because we're really more of a global world now, so it's easy to order an exotic ingredient using the internet than it used to be. So, but in years past, a lot of times people would come to the United States and they would want to cook authentic meals, authentic cultural meals from home, but they really weren't able to find the appropriate ingredients because they just didn't exist here in the United States. So, so a lot of times substitutions were required. So people would be ingenious and find different ingredients that sort of were similar to what they were used to, but not exactly the same thing. So what would happen is that dishes would be almost authentic, but maybe a little bit different. And at the end of this lecture, I'm going to have you all listen to something from the internet on the history of corned beef and cabbage. And of course, on St. Patrick's Day, we're all about corned beef and cabbage, and it's so Irish. But the thing about corned beef and cabbage is that it's really not Irish at all. It's actually an American substitution, and so you'll see that in the video. Many times there are what are called terroir differences. You'll see the word there. It looks like terror, but it's not terror. Terroir is it's a way of explaining how foods taste different when they're grown in different types of soil. So you may have a crop of, let's just say, beets, and the beets taste this way in a particular country because of the type of soil that they're in. Any of you who maybe drink wine, you may have heard that term before. Depending on where wine grapes are grown, they will have a particular flavor, and they take on the flavor of the soil. And so a wine like, say, a Cabernet Sauvignon can taste very different, all other things equal. It can taste very different simply because of the type of soil that it's grown in. So that can happen here too. If you have something like beets that's, in the home country is grown one particular way, and then you come to the United States and it's different, well, that may not be authentic. It's the same ingredient, but it may not taste the same. So many times substitutions are identified. They go out and find other ingredients that can kind of stand in for the native ingredient that they can't find in the United States or whatever country they're going to. And over time, each generation will adapt to that resulting preparation. So somebody immigrates to another country, they have to change their foods, and each of the new generations that are learning about ways to cook these cultural meals are adopting these substitutions and making them gospel, more or less. This is the way that we do it. This is what we use. So, so things do change slowly over time. This next slide is a bit on a food history guideline, and the reason I included this in here is because much of what native cultures eat and how their cuisines developed was largely based on what was growing in the area at the time. If you remember me talking about how humans, before they settled down, were really spending a lot of time roaming around, eating to live, really just sort of walking around and trying to figure out what in different areas was available and what was edible and what wasn't going to kill you. So if we take a look at this food history guideline, this goes all the way back to 10,000 years BC. And really sort of what was happening during that time. So Southwest Asia, we're talking about India, we're talking about many of those countries that are right in and around India, the subcontinent. Wheat, barley, sheep, and goat domesticated. So this is a process where people were starting to settle down. They were starting to plant these things. They were starting to herd these animals. And these were things that were just in the area. And so they began to, once they realized it wasn't going to kill them, they began to figure out what to do with these items. They could make bread, they could make cereals and porridge. They could make mush. They could make a lot of different items. And there was a lot of food technology that was invented over the years, over the millennia, to help process these foods. In the case of wheat and grains, we had millstones, whether it was somebody manually operating it or livestock running the millstones, so you could grind these grains into flour to use to make other things. So, so that's Southeast Asia, or Southwest Asia rather. 8000 BC, Mexico, chilies and squash. So that is what was growing around that area. So ancient civilizations in Mexico used them. They didn't kill the people, so they began to use these ingredients in their cuisine. 8000 BC, Peru, lima beans. 7000 BC, Southwest Asia. Again, the Indian subcontinent, bread was developed. So this is flatbreads. They found, once they figured out how to grind up the grain, they figured out how to make bread. You add some water to it. Northern China, millet, 6000 BC. Millet is a grain that is still used as a food source in many places in the world. Not so much here in the United States. Millet in the United States is used in bird seeds. So even though in China and parts of Africa, millet is still an important grain, not so much here in the United States. But 6000 BC. So that's another grain that they learned how to make bread and cakes and things with. Middle East, BC, 6000 BC, apples, grapes, the Caucasus region. We'll talk more about that. This is actually where it's thought that the first wine was made. Southwest Asia, again, Indian subcontinent. Cattle, chickpea, lentils. This is 5 to 6000 BC. If you look at Indian food, there's a lot of lentils and there's a lot of chickpeas in it. It's because that's what was growing around that area at that time it was discovered. Southern China, rice, 5000 BC. Southern China, a lot of rice is eaten. And we can go on and go through this, but the point that I want you to understand with this slide is, as I've said, native cuisine always comes from what happened to be growing wherever people settled down.
So on this slide we see a few examples from different parts of the world as far as foods that were native to the areas where those populations originally settled down. And they're, in many cases, foods that represent that culture to this day. So if we look at Mexico, beans, squash, chilies, corn, mangoes, and other tropical fruits are traditional foods and definitely foods that we see reflected in the cuisine today. Caribbean, South America, cassava, which is an underground starchy tuber, and we'll talk more about cassava. Goat, black beans, bananas, plantains, and so on. And you can look at all the different foods on this slide and just know that many of them are still strongly represented in those cuisines today.
So the omnivore's paradox is really what I was talking about a few slides ago. Humans are omnivorous, and that just means that we're able to digest a wide variety of plants and animals. The paradox part is that we needed to be able to eat different types of food to survive, to get a wide complement of nutrients, but we weren't sure about what was going to kill us. And if you think about it, that's a really big gamble. If you eat something that you're not familiar with, for our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, that may very well have been a gamble with your life. You eat the wrong thing and you die. So it's something that over time we've had to figure out. And in many cases, this led people to migrate to, in ancient history, led people to migrate to places where safe food was available that would meet the needs for growth and development and a wide variety of nutrients that would keep people healthy. All right, I always get people cringing when they see this picture. This is a young Southeast Asian lady eating a very large spider. And this slide, what I want to talk about here is food habits and food taboos. Depending on your cultural background and where you live, food sources and things that are considered to be appropriate to eat and things that are considered inappropriate to eat are going to be wildly different. So generally, humans break down foods by different categories that we see here, consciously or unconsciously. The first category is inedible. This food is just, you can't eat it because it's either poisonous. If you eat it, it's going to make you very sick or it's going to kill you, or it's somehow taboo, forbidden. So an example of a taboo would be why people who are Hindu are not going to eat beef. They're not going to eat a cow because they consider that animal to be sacred. So to eat a cow would be, or eat beef, would be considered absolutely taboo and wrong. So a cow to a Hindu person is going to be inedible. I can't eat that. Second category is edible by animals but not by me. So this may be things that people in a particular culture wouldn't eat. And we just talked about millet as bird food. So in the United States, millet are these little round, sort of cream-colored, creamy yellow-colored grains, and you see them in bird food, and mostly that's what it is. So to a person from the United States, that would be considered, millet is considered, edible by animals, but not by me. That's not something I'm going to use as a food source. But again, in many places of the world, that's considered perfectly okay to eat. Okay, third category is edible by humans, but quote unquote, not my kind. So this is where the insects fall in. So a lot of times cultural delicacies fit in here, things that people from a particular culture really enjoy, whether it's insects or organ meats or just something that has processing that makes it very strongly flavored, is considered edible by some cultures, but I'm not going to eat that because it's weird. I'm not going to eat a big huge spider because that's gross. Well, that's not right or wrong, that's just personally what our culture would not consider appropriate. And of course, most majority Americans would agree with that. We don't generally tend to look at insects as food. Fourth category is edible by humans, but not me. So this might be a food that is generally accepted by a cultural group, but this is where individual preference comes in. So maybe if you are Scandinavian and fish is a big part of the diet, but you don't personally like fish, that's where that would fit in. And then finally, edible by me. That is anything that an individual person would eat and is considered appropriate. So for some people who are very, very picky, sometimes that category can be really, really tiny. So, but that's all personal, and that goes beyond culture. That's just really down to the level of the individual. We're going to talk about core and complementary food models, and we've already talked a bit about this when we talked about different cultures that have certain foods that are really common in the diet. Like with Mexico, we saw beans and rice and corn and those sorts of things. So, and I'm going to be referring back to this at different times of the class, and so I want you to think in these terms. The core and complementary food model groups foods according to frequency and consumption. So, when we look at this first category of core foods, what that means is types of foods that are eaten at almost every meal, or at least eaten daily by people in that culture. So, usually the foods that fall into this group are starchy, and they're grain based many times. They're generally very high carbohydrate, and they generally consist of native crops. So, if we look at the diet of a native Mexican person, a core food is probably going to be tortillas. Corn tortillas or flour tortillas, depending on the person's preferences and where they're from. That is a starchy food, and it's probably something that they're going to eat at least daily and probably at multiple meals. So those core foods are every single day. Okay, for a person who lives in southern China, rice is going to be very important, and many other Asian countries throughout the world, rice is something that's eaten at least once a day, if not more. So again, another example of a very starchy food. So a lot of times these core foods are breads, they're grains, very starchy items. Sometimes they're starchy roots, which can fall more under the vegetable label, but generally they're very high carbohydrate. And just from as a nutritional note, the carbohydrates are where we get our energy to do things, and so the majority of the diet should be made of carbohydrates, and so the core foods generally fit that bill. Complementary foods are foods that are commonly eaten, but they are used in smaller portions. So many times what complementary foods are is they add interest to the core food. And the core foods, because they're generally very starchy and high in carbohydrates, many times they're also very bland. So if you eat, plain white rice or corn tortillas, they don't have a whole lot of flavor on their own, but frequently things are added to them that give them the flavor and make them much more interesting. So in Mexico, that might be chilies or different herbs that are added. So those are going to be complementary foods. Herbs, spices, vegetables. Many times, those are things that are going to be considered complementary and flavor up those core foods. Secondary foods are very commonly used but not eaten daily. So a lot of times meats will fit into this group. So a culture may eat a lot of fish, but maybe it's not eaten every day because there are other meats that are eaten. So fish, chicken, beef, pork, those sorts of things will fit into the secondary category. And then peripheral foods are, again, a little bit more individual. These are things that are not specifically tied to culture or cultural use, but they may be things that the individual likes. So something like ice cream might fit into this, where it's not particularly linked to a culture, but it's just an item that somebody from a culture, any particular culture, may decide that they want. It's not considered wrong or inappropriate to eat. So those are called peripheral foods. Generally, when people immigrate to other countries, we talked about how food habits are one of the last ones to go. When the changes in food habits do occur, it's usually the core foods that are the very, very last to change, because that is the most ingrained habit. If I am from Mexico, I am used to eating tortillas, and even if I were to immigrate to the United States, I'm still going to continue to eat my tortillas. because that's my habit, that's what I do, and that's what's considered normal. So speaking of Mexico, we have a couple of, I've put this on here as an example for the core and complementary food model. So core food for a Mexican person, a native Mexican person, would include beans, rice, corn, wheat in the form of breads or tortillas. So again, those are all very starchy, very high carbohydrate items. Secondary foods would be, chicken, pork, fish, nopales, that's cactus paddles, eggs, those sorts of things are secondary foods, not necessarily eaten every single day, but a regular part of the diet for many of the people in that culture. Complementary foods include chilies, different herbs, cilantro, epazote. That's something that is very difficult to find in the United States. And so people need to find substitutions for that. Peripheral food, again, might include something like ice cream. Then there are what we refer to as cultural superfoods. So a superfood is, as you see here on the slide, foods and or ingredients that are so common that they can literally define a cuisine. So spaghetti is considered very Italian. Tacos are Mexican. Sushi is Japanese. And sometimes these are ingredients like fish sauce. You see used in many Asian cuisines, the salty fish sauce. Injera bread we talked about with Ethiopian cuisine. That is something that's used at virtually every meal. So then there are many of these foods that are considered superfoods. The one that I have here in the picture is Spam. Spam is in Hawaii a really, really big deal, and it's not really a big deal anywhere else. But for whatever reason, Hawaiians have latched onto Spam, and it is part of the Hawaiian food culture, strangely enough. So as we've been talking about throughout this lecture, how food is handled, harvested, grown, and processed can become native food practices. Again, because people spent so much time trying to figure out how to survive and thrive in the areas that they settled in. So the practices may have been by necessity, or accident, whatever the cause was, they stuck and became native food practices. The example I have here is lutefisk, which is a Scandinavian fish preparation where white fish is dried with lye and then soaked to reconstitute. So again, this is an example of trying to preserve fish in a time where refrigeration didn't exist. So this dried fish could be kept for long periods of time without spoiling and then reconstituted when needed. It's definitely an acquired taste. The fish takes on sort of a jellied texture, which is not real appetizing if you're not used to it, but people who enjoy it are generally people who have been used to it over a long period of time. The other example I have here is something called nixtamalization. And that is actually a practice that Mexican people have used for, and even the Mexican Indians have used for really long periods of time to treat corn that has been ground up with calcium hydroxide. And that does two things. It actually makes the corn a lot easier to grind for use in breads or tortillas. But one of the other things that it does is it actually enhances the nutrient content. And we'll talk more about this in the Mexico lecture. But one of the things that it does is it releases a B vitamin called niacin, which is otherwise unabsorbable by humans, but this treatment actually allows that to happen. So it enhances the nutrient content of corn. Many times in many cultures there are different foods that are lent symbolic meaning. And a lot of times those symbolic meanings have to do with the way the food appears. So, so knowing everything that we do about food and culture at this point, the question that we need to ask is, what is American food? And I think that for many people, when you ask that question, we think of things like hot dogs and hamburgers and apple pie and all that kind of stuff. But the thing about those is that they all originated elsewhere. None of those is American. Hot dogs and hamburgers are actually German, and apple pie is a French invention. So the question we need to ask is, who was here first? Is American food Native American foods? And how has that changed? So, America is a huge melting pot of multiple cultures. We know that mix of cultures is changing and will continue to change. And so, there's not a real easy answer to what exactly American food is. And that may just be something that well, it's one of the reasons that the U.S. is so interesting, is because that mix is always changing. There's really no easy answers here. When we look at the United States as a whole, we can recognize that there are several recognized regional cuisines. We're not going to be going way into depth on that in this class, but certainly barbecue is big in some regions. Cajun cooking down in New Orleans and down in that area is big. California cuisine, of course, we hear a lot about farm to fork, and California is sort of big in that as well. New Mexican cooking, New England cooking, there's all kinds of different regions. So as far as American food goes, there's really no hard and fast answer, but I guess for our purposes, you will now understand that hot dogs and hamburgers and apple pie are not considered Native American food. One of the things about American cuisine, in whatever shape that it takes, whether we're talking about fast foods or even foods that we've adopted like the hamburgers and the hot dogs. One of the things that, if you've traveled in the world at all, you may notice is that there's a lot of Americanization of cuisines from other cultures. One of the things that in the United States we do is we eat a lot more calories, and we eat a lot more protein than many other world cultures. And protein is, from a nutritional standpoint, something that is very important for growth and maintenance of body tissues. And it's something that here in the U.S. we take a little bit more for granted. A lot of countries and regions of the world, getting protein and getting adequate protein is really sort of a luxury. It's meat is simply not available, or it's prohibitively expensive. And in many countries, meat is not the center of the plate. Here in the United States, that tends to be a little bit more what happens, that the meals are built around meat, whereas in many other cultures and cuisines, meat is more considered a condiment and something that complements the main meal. And this is particularly true in poorer countries where, again, meat and proteins tend to be much more expensive. And I think that we've all had the experience of eating Americanized foods, Americanized ethnic foods, things like pizza, things like Mexican food, Chinese foods. And if you've ever had the experience where you've gone to the country where that food is from, you may find a really different experience. When I was a teenager, I went to Europe for the first time, and tried Italian pizza, real Italian pizza, And I was really disappointed because it was nothing like what I was expecting. And of course, I was very used to American pizza, and what I got didn't really resemble that all that much. So it was sort of a an eye opener for me. Um, Many of the other Americanized ethnic foods that we serve in this country, whether it's fast food or in restaurants or those sorts of things, can sometimes be very surprising to somebody who's from that country because they may not recognize it as the food from their country because we've added so much more protein and calories and really made it into something that it's not. I've touched on globalization a little bit during this lecture. Overall food culture is changing a lot because it is so easy to get any type of food delivered to you. Globalization is, as you see in the slide here, the integration of local, regional, and national phenomena into an unrestricted worldwide organization. So, the internet has made information and goods exchange really easy. And so there's a lot more information out there about true cultural eating and ingredients and preparation and history. And it's available in a way that it really hasn't been before. So it really has sort of made the world a little bit smaller in that information is so readily available. And certainly we have more and more people who are traveling and people who are considered foodies. And so these are the folks that go around and sort of eat their way around the globe. So a lot more information out there, and it just makes things much more interesting.